This is Dr. Kumar Taylor, and this is the video on using and filling out the quantitative analysis worksheet. At this point, you should have a lot of good ideas about your research. You should have already talked with me and decided what is your theoretical and conceptual frameworks are going to look like, what question you think you're going to ask, which may change, but you've worked through a lot of those ideas and you may have a good solid idea of what the research methodology will look like, but you also may still be early in that, and so this worksheet is going to help you look at those, and it's going to help you analyze what you've decided, why you've decided it, and how then it's going to strengthen your arguments in your paper because you're going to know how everything fits together. So let's look at the worksheet. I guess I need to hit the correct button to do sharing. Okay. And now you should see the quantitative analysis worksheet, and this is version 1.4, July 24th, 2017. This worksheet is subject to change and hopefully always tweaking it for the better based on input and experience. And so always check to see that you've got the latest version, which should be what's posted in Education 754, 751, and 752. So whichever of those three classes you're in, you should see this worksheet and be able to fill it out one more time and make sure you've got your most up-to-date ideas in it so that you've connected everything. Okay, purpose of the study, that's not hard to define. Just jot down in a couple of sentences why you are doing this study, because it's real important. No, tell me why. Tell me why you want to do this study. Number two, identify the frameworks. And at this point, you should have thought about both theoretical and conceptual. If you're still unclear on that, let me give you the lowdown. Conceptual framework is all those little details of what you're studying that tells you exactly what to look at and trying to answer your questions. And then the theoretical framework is how to look at it. Okay, so the conceptual framework, again, tells you what to look at, and the theoretical framework helps you understand how to think about it. So here is one example. If you're looking at the changing the number of bad behaviors or behavior referrals using a certain technique, then you're probably doing something with the idea of the whole child, or you're doing something where you're getting them to reframe the way they think about school. Building relationships and making them a part of your school community. So a theoretical framework that would fit, you could do schools as communities, communities as practice. You can do use the concept of the whole child to keep checking back and making sure we're serving all aspects in our approach. And that just helps you look at the items in your conceptual framework, which will include things like the parent-child interactions, teacher-child interactions, and give you specifics on things to try out and do. But you make sense out of those things by going back to what does the theory about the whole child mean in terms of using parent-child interactions. So it helps you make sense out of things. So make sure you name and describe your theoretical framework. The conceptual framework may not have a name. The theoretical framework almost always has a name because it's a theory. But the conceptual framework may or may not have a name. And you're really just describing in a couple of sentences what information that you found in your lit review that you know you're going to have to look at and be a part of your actual research and data collection and analysis. Okay, so write your quantitative research question here. Why did I say only one per worksheet? That's just crazy. No, each time you analyze, you might have different forms of data. And when you have different forms of data, you may or may not need to use different kinds of tests. So if you have 3 quantitative research questions or 2, go through this twice. Go through this 3 times, whatever it takes, because it'll be more clear down here, I'll point out. So the hypothesis and the null hypothesis, you should know by now what that means, but hypothesis is what you think is going to happen, and the null hypothesis is basically stating that nothing happened. There was no difference, or there is no correlation, or something like that. Definition of key terms is exactly what it says. It is definition of key terms, and you're doing this with 2 things in mind. One, the uninformed reader just needs to know the technical jargon that you're using. And 2, the informed reader, the researcher who, or another person who's doing their dissertation on the same topic looks at your dissertation, and they really need to know what you mean when you say reading comprehension, or when you say behavior disorders, or whatever the relevant terms are that you know you're going to have to study. You need the name of the term and a definition which was defined by somebody who is not you. And then give me the in-text citation that you're going to use in the paper. And the reason we do that is so that I know you didn't just make this up. You can make things up from your data, but before you go into the data, you already have to know some key terms you're looking at that have been defined by somebody else. And that's what this section is. Identify and classify your variables. Okay, now normally we don't have more than 1, or I guess 2 or 3 variables in a quantitative study. There are quantitative studies that compare achievement to a list of things and do multiple regression. So that's why there are so many blanks. Most of the dissertations at Carson Newman do not use all the blanks, so don't freak out about it. If you've got one thing with 1 independent and 1 dependent, then you're going to fill out 2 blanks. Okay, if it's, so do the number of variables that your question includes. For each variable, you're going to have to say, is it the independent variable or dependent variable? And then, and I've listed the pages in the book that helps you decide that if you don't know already. And so, or you need a refresher. Page 116 is the most helpful, but there's a whole section on it, 3 pages there. So use the text and make sure you've got the right kind of variable, because Um, and this is, by the way, highly tied to instrumentation. How are you going to quantify it? How are you measuring? So you list the variable, you list how you're measuring. And as soon as you do that, as soon as you know what kind of number you're producing and what kind of numbers are possible, that's how you know uh, whether it's nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio. So you have to uh, look both at 6 and 7 kind of simultaneously. Okay, then so continuing on 7, we've got how will you establish the validity. If it's measurement tool that somebody else has created, you say they created it and establish validity. And then reliability, same thing. If you're doing a survey, you're going to have to go through a process, if you created it, that you're going to have to establish validity and reliability in a pilot study. So you're going to have to give the details. If you can't give the details, you have to either create them or either look them up if it's an existing instrument, or if you're creating the instrument, you're going to have to do some work to establish validity and reliability. So prepare yourself. If you don't know the answer, that you need to work to find an answer. And there's various ways of establishing validity and reliability. Again, these are kind of things that are covered in the textbook. They're covered in videos on YouTube. They're just covered, and I can answer some questions, but don't just lay it out there and go, I don't know. Give me some ideas. We can bounce things back and forth. Okay, so once you know how you're measuring your variables, what kind of variable, what kind of numbers they are, then you can use some guides to tell you which test you need to do. If you asked about relationship between two variables, that's going to be a correlation, and you need to decide whether it's a Pearson correlation, a Spearman correlation, or a chi-square. If you're trying to see are these two scores, the pre and post, are they significantly different? That's going to be things like t-test, ANOVA, etc. How do you decide what you have and what you can do? Well, I posted a cheat sheet in the resources folder. There's also a textbook, page 614 and 15 gives you a brief overview. And my Pinterest account has a bunch of pinned articles and pictures that give you sort of a graphical look at what do you have, what type of variable, what type of independent, and it just guides you through and leads you to the conclusion on what the test is and how you know it's the right test. So answer all 3 questions. Now the test assumptions, it can be a wide variety of things, but it's usually things like the assumption for a t-test is that the independent variable is normally distributed. You're not supposed to remember this off the top of your head, but this is something that you can look up. So once you've selected your test, and you've justified how you know it's the right test because it matches your question and makes sense with the variables, then you look up the assumptions and you list, and then you decide how you're going to check them. Now, were the assumptions met, yes or no? Some of these things you can't know until after you've collected data. Some of these you can assume relatively safely, but some of them you have to check after the fact. So if that's the case, you don't say yes or no, you say I will check after the fact. If the assumption is not met before you collect data or after you collect data, this is a no-go. You have to pick a different test. And that's not a complete loss. You don't freak out just because you did it and the assumption wasn't met. There's a test for that. I guarantee you. It could be an obscure one, but it's going to be there, and it's going to help you get the answer that you want. So this is just to double check that the test really does fit. All right. Number 10, identify the population to which you want to generalize. This is not your sample. Are you trying to say all the 7th grade students, that whatever you're studying is going to be true for all 7th grade students? Then your population is all 7th grade students. If it's just 7th grade students in rural schools, say 7th grade students in rural schools. Whatever you want to be able to say at the end, this is true for blank. Well, what's the blank? Now your sampling method, you don't sample the whole population because usually your population is huge. And that's why we select, and some of you are doing convenient sampling, because it's your classes. Some of you are going a little bit more elaborate, doing your classes plus some classes that match demographics and achievement, and you can talk about that. It may take an explanation. It may not be just a one name thing. So a matching sample set from my class and this other class, and teachers say why it's a safe sampling method, and explain how it's a good representation of the population that you want to generalize the results to. And then what will the N be? What is the number of participants in your study to answer this question? It's quantitative, so you should be more than 20, and 500 is better. The law of large numbers in play, and so the bigger your N, the better. If you only have access to 20, that's going to be or less, that's going to be a huge limitation, and some tests won't be valid. So you're going to have to think about that carefully and think about how many participants you're going to have in your sample. Okay, and if you have too small of a sample, it's going to be one of your weaknesses, a limitation. So you put in here the 20 people in sample is a limitation because it may not be a good representation of all of the population. So list the things that are limitations, list the things that make it more generalizable, and anything that you want to add that you're doing a technique to strengthen the study, this is where you can put it. Okay, then on the last page, I actually tell you about resources to use when you actually go to do your analysis. So make sure you take a look at that. All right, well, that is the general overview of how to fill out the quantitative analysis worksheet. I've also done a video on the qualitative. So if you're doing that you should be watching that video. And all right, so let me know if you have questions. Thank you, and I will see you online.